All right. Good morning, everyone. This is February 7th, 2021. This is the Faith Function class. The teacher is Patrick Gray, and this class is being recorded. Go, Judy.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Okay, well, we're real fortunate this morning to have Patrick Gray as our instructor. Patrick is a professor of religious studies at Rhodes College, as we just talked about. He received his doctorate in religion from Emory University. Previously, he taught at Emory and at Oglethorpe University, as well as in Japan. His next book, which comes out in April, is the Cambridge Companion to the New Testament, published by Cambridge University Press. Patrick's going to be with us for this week and 2 more Sundays, and he's going to be talking about Alexander the Great in the Bible. So before we begin, let me just check and see how everybody's doing. Do we have any joys or concerns that people would like to share?
There's a new guy in church this morning.
Yes, that's certainly a joy. We have a new pastor, his first sermon today. I'd also like to ask for prayers for Terry Bishop, who is battling cancer, and for his wife, Carol. Okay, well, let's bow our heads for prayer. Holy God of love, we thank you this morning for this day with all its blessings and opportunities, and especially for this opportunity to gather together and to learn from your word. Remember before you those of our members who require healing and comfort for themselves or their loved ones. Especially we remember Terry Bishop and his wife, Carol. We also ask your blessing on our new pastor, David Powers, as he begins his ministry at Idlewild. Lord, through your Holy Spirit, open our ears, minds, and hearts to the teaching of your word this day. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, well, welcome, Patrick, and take it away.
All right, now I think I am unmuted, so I hope you can hear me. It's good to be here. Congratulations on your new pastor. It's auspicious that he begins, I guess, on Super Bowl Sunday. I hope it's a super relationship for you guys. All right, so the topic is Alexander the Great in the Bible. I'm going to start with a true-false question, and that is, true or false? Alexander the Great appears in the Bible. True or false? So give a thumbs down if you say, no, he is not in the Bible. Give a thumbs up if you think he is in the Bible. All right. Well, it's complicated. So let me unpack it. So first, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. And talk about where Alexander the Great appears in the book of First Maccabees. Now, we'll come back to that. A number of you are already saying, wait a minute, I didn't know that was in the Bible. And if you're Protestant, it's not really in the Bible, though it may actually be in a Bible that you own. Like here, this is the New Oxford Annotated Bible, which includes the books that are in the Protestant Bible, the Jewish Bible, and the Catholic Bible, and the Eastern Orthodox Bible. Even though, and many Protestants will use this Bible, except that these books, which Protestants call the Apocrypha, aren't included in it. But they were in there for a long time and still are for hundreds of millions of Christians, just not the Protestants. But in the book called First Maccabees, which describes events mostly that took place in the 2nd century BC, Alexander the Great appears right at the very beginning. And can you guys see this on the shared screen? I don't know if it's big enough to read, but I'll read it to you. And from the very beginning of that book, it says, after Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians, he succeeded him as king. Now, land of Kittim is for a lot of ancient Israelites, ancient Jews, that was a term that was sometimes applied to the Greeks, sometimes applied to the Romans. Basically, any land kind of to the west of Turkey, modern day Turkey, could be lumped under the heading of Kittim. So here he's talking about Alexander the Great, who, as verse 1 notes, he had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, he conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth had become quiet before him, he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they became tributary to him. And after this, he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers who had been brought up with him from youth and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander reigned for 12 years, he died. Very concise overview of his life and illustrious career. We will, there aren't a lot of details here. We'll talk about some of those details. But this provides the backdrop in First Maccabees to the events of the years about 167 to 164 BC and what's called the Maccabean Revolt. So here he appears in the Bible, but like I said, it's complicated. Maybe we put an asterisk there, just like we put an asterisk next to, Barry Bonds' home run record, that he broke Hank Aaron's, though maybe, we shouldn't count that because he broke the rules. We'll put an asterisk by this. Maybe it's in the Bible, maybe it's not in the Bible. So I'll give you credit whether you answer true or false on that one. But it's further complicated by another text that I'm going to bring up here. All right, so let me bring it over here and show you something from the book of Daniel. But before I talk about the book of Daniel, which is in everybody's Bible, so this part's not complicated, sort of. Well, no, it's still complicated. Before I talk about the book of Daniel, I'm going to talk about Alexander, the story about Alexander told by a Jewish historian named Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian in the 1st century. He dies around the year 100 AD. So he's contemporary with the writing of the New Testament. He is one of the most prolific Jewish writers in the 1st century AD. Now, he's living in the 1st century AD, but he's telling stories in a book called The Antiquities of the Jews. And this is basically a long retelling of the history of the Jewish people from way, way, way back up until his time. Greatly embellished over what you find in a lot of the biblical accounts, and including lots and lots of material that's not included in biblical accounts. So one of the stories Josephus tells, it takes place around the year 332, 331 BC. So Alexander, maybe I should just tell you a little bit about Alexander. So Alexander was born in 356. Let me come back to Josephus in a minute. Alexander the Great. He wasn't born the Great, though if you ask him or his mom, he was born the Great. And we'll talk about that in a second. 356, he's actually Alexander the Third. Nobody really knows much about Alexander the First or Alexander the Second. His father was a guy named Philip II of Macedon, where current Macedonia is, very close to Greece, just kind of up around the bend from Greece. But he was a king. Philip II was king. And his mother was named Olympias. Because he was a king, he had really good tutors. He was homeschooled, but he had really good tutors. Does anybody know who Alexander's personal tutor was? Also starts with an A.
Aristotle?
You're good, Aristotle. So he had like the best possible tutor, one of the smartest men ever to live. So he absorbed, Greek culture, which was, just down the road anyway. He learned the art and science of warfare from his father, Philip. Historians think that his mother, Olympias, was more influential in his life. He inherited, a profound love of learning and also a fiery, sometimes ruthless nature. During his early years, his mother apparently constantly told him that he was partly God, partly divine. Her family had long claimed to be descended from the hero Achilles, the great Greek hero Achilles. And at one point, she even told him that his true father was not Philip, but Zeus, the king of gods. I don't know how that went over with Philip, but that's what she told him. And he seems to have kind of soaked this up. Later on, he would claim to be divine, a son of God. Maybe that's a phrase you've heard before. Now, in his adult years, just kind of going with that a minute, he would, when he went off and started, fighting battles, he took a copy of Homer's Iliad, the story of Achilles and the Trojan War. He took a copy of that everywhere and slept with a copy of it beneath his pillow, according to, the accounts we have. So this is what's going on in his upbringing. Now he embarks, so when he's about 20 years old, his father is assassinated. And he becomes king. Did he have a role in the assassination? Does mom have a role in the assassination? We don't know, but Alexander becomes king and begins a march around the world. He conquers, he's already in control of his own homeland, Macedonia. He conquers Greece. He conquers Turkey, what is today called Turkey. Much of the Holy Land down into Africa, northern Africa he conquers. He treks across the Middle East, conquering, what we think of today as Jordan, Iraq, Iran, all the way to the edge of India, where his men then said, who loved him, but said, we're not marching any further. So he goes to the edge of India, conquers this massive empire, and then kind of starts coming back. He dies in Babylon in the year 323. So that's just a very brief biography of him. But coming back to our true-false question, was Alexander the Great in the Bible? This is a roundabout answer here. I want to come back to a story that takes place in the middle of his life. That's recounted by Josephus. And it has to do with when he is going to take control of, the Holy Land of Judea. It's around 332 BC. He had conquered Asia Minor. He had besieged, defeated the cities on the coast, Tyre and Gaza, on his way to Egypt. And during that campaign, he turns towards Jerusalem, which is not right on the coast, but not too far out of his way. He goes towards Jerusalem, and as he's approaching Jerusalem, according to Josephus, the high priest in Jerusalem comes out to meet him with a bunch of other people from the temple. They're not sure what's going to happen. He had wiped out some other cities who had opposed him. And according to Josephus, Alexander says that when he sees the high priest from Jerusalem, he realizes, hey, I've seen you before in a dream. He says, I'd seen you in a dream, and that this was an omen then. He's like, I've seen this guy, I've seen the high priest, and it gave him confidence that he would conquer his enemies and gain dominion over the land. So after this, Josephus reports that then Alexander accompanies the high priest into the temple in Jerusalem and offers sacrifice to the God of Israel, and is very kind and generous to the high priest and his helpers there, the other priests. But the story doesn't end there. According to Josephus, when Alexander is there, then the Jewish leaders say, you saw us in a dream, but we saw you coming too. And what they do is say, we want to show you something in our holy books, in the book of Daniel, in the prophet Daniel. And they read, let me see, Daniel, a lot of the book of Daniel is apocalyptic in nature, like the book of Revelation. A lot of the imagery that we find in the book of Revelation is drawn from the book of Daniel. A lot of animals, lots of numbers. And they said, here's part of the book of Daniel, chapter 8. Here, I'll just highlight a little bit here. And it says, as I was watching, so this is Daniel speaking, And this is what the priests are showing Alexander the Great, according to Josephus. As I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between his eyes. It came towards the ram with 2 horns that I'd seen standing beside the river. Kind of a crazy image here, a crazy vision. It ran at it with savage force. I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground and trampled upon it. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. Then the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, the great horn was broken. In its place, there came up 4 prominent horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. Now, a few verses later in Daniel, Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, interprets this vision and says, let me see. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king, as for, so on and so forth. All right, so according to Josephus, the priests show this to Alexander the Great and say, this is you. Our holy books prophesied your victory, which made him happy. It kind of was further affirmation that he was doing the will of the gods, even the will of this God of a people who I don't, that I'm not part of. So back to our true false question: is Alexander the Great in the Bible? Is he not? Well, it depends on whether you believe that this is a prophecy of Alexander the Great. Most scholars would say the book of Daniel, which is set in the 6th century BC, so the 500s during the Babylonian period, may actually have been written in the 2nd century BC, a century or so after Alexander the Great. And this is made to look like a prophecy, but it's really written after the fact. I don't know. Well, we do know that Josephus, at least, is telling this story. So somewhere along the line in Jewish tradition, these things get mixed up. Well, like I said, it's complicated, right? So I'll give you credit for a true or a false on either one. So you grade your own papers and report to, I don't know if Judy or Rick is keeping score, keeping the grade book for the class, but I'll give you credit for either one. All right, let me unshare my screen for a minute so that I can see more of you. How do I unshare that? Pause share. All right, so thanks for your patience here. So whether or not you think that Josephus, that story is true, that the prophecy there does really show Alexander the Great in the Bible, whether or not you think that First Maccabees, what I was first talking about, is in the Bible, what I want to try to help you see today and next few weeks is I want to help you appreciate the influence that Alexander the Great has had directly and indirectly on the Bible, the history of Judaism, history of Christianity. And we're going to look at Alexander the Great in from 3 different perspectives. We're going to look first at Alexander the Great from a political or a military perspective and his significance. We're going to look at his cultural significance, and we're going to think about his religious and philosophical significance. So just to kind of orient you to today and the next 2 Sundays. So that's where we're going to go. Let me stop there, see if you've got any questions or comments on the quiz that I gave you, the true false questions. Do you want to argue and say that your answer is right or wrong? Like I said, I'm going to give you credit for whatever your answer was, but let me just stop there for a minute and see if you have any comments. All right, I'm going to try to share something else here. Stop share. So the first thing I want to do is I want to place Alexander who founded one of the largest empires known to the human race up to that time, and actually one of the largest ever. I want to place Alexander in the context of a succession of different empires that played a role in Israel's history. So then we can see how he's similar and how he's different to some of these other empires. So I'm going to back up a little bit, give you kind of a whirlwind tour of the kind of political and military history of the region and how Alexander plays a role in that. But the first thing to keep in mind, so he's founding an empire, and it's helpful to remember that Israel is really, really small. It's easy to forget that because it looms very large in the Bible, right? And when we watch movies, we watch the Ten Commandments and other kind of biblical sword and sandal epics. We see these huge armies. It looks like, kind of an epic sort of story. But Israel's small. It's really small. It's about the size of New Jersey. That'll help us understand some of the things that are going to go on here. All right, I'm going to try to share a slideshow here. From the current slide, and then I want to share my screen. All right. So can you guys see this slideshow that I have? Okay. So here I've put some dates up that are going to play into the story I'm going to tell here for a few minutes. All right. So first, like I said, Israel's really small. Going back to the year 1000 BC, David becomes king of Israel. And it's a time when all the tribes of Israel are united under one king. That's why it's called sometimes the United Monarchy, or the United Kingdom, which lasts for about 80 years, from about 1000 BC until about 922 under David and his son Solomon. It's often seen as the golden age of ancient Israel. But then there is a civil war, so to speak, after the death of Solomon, when Israel splits into two different kingdoms, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, called Judah in the south, where Jerusalem is, and Israel in the north. So this period of time is called the divided kingdom or divided monarchy. Now, Judah and Israel are not, they're not at constant war for 200 years. On and off, they're at war. But they have different kings, different capitals, different worship places until the year 722 BC. And this is the first of a succession. Again, Israel's small, but they're surrounded by a lot of much larger powers. In 722, Assyria, the Assyrian Empire, with its capital, which is at Nineveh, comes from northern Mesopotamia and comes to the land of Israel. The northern kingdom, Israel, decides to try to fight against the Assyrians, and Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem, says, God, through the prophet Isaiah, is telling us maybe we should sit this one out because they're a pretty big, powerful army. We can go into a lot more detail, but what happens is Assyria destroys the northern kingdom. In fact, we never hear from it anymore. The lost tribes of Israel, this is when they get lost. We never really hear from them ever again. Now, the southern kingdom, Judah, says we're not going to fight, so they're not destroyed. They are made a vassal state, subjugated to Assyria, but they survive. And a lot of the people, the people from the north are forcibly deported. And so, and this area is repopulated by a lot of non-Jewish people. So that's the first empire that in this period controls this land. Remember, Israel's small. It's here on the coast, right at a crossroads. Down here, you've got Egypt, which is a big empire that has a long history with Israel. Up here, you've got, Europe up here, and then all these empires over here that I'm going to talk more about. And so, at a crossroads here, whenever they're trying to fight with each other, when the Assyrians are trying to fight with the Egyptians, who gets caught there? It's Israel. So they're always getting kicked around. They're a pawn in these larger imperial games. Judah survives, like I said, in a weakened state to be sure, but they survive until 586 BC, when the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar come to town. They conquer the Assyrians. And this time, Judah decides we're going to fight. And it doesn't go very well. They're destroyed. The temple is destroyed. This is a debacle. It's a catastrophe without parallel in ancient Judaism. Most of the people there are dispersed from the land. The leading families are exiled to Babylon, capital Babylonium. It's called the Babylonian exile, right? So this is another empire that's had a large impact on the biblical story. Now, in the 6th century, then much of the Bible is written from the perspective of exile, with the Babylonian Empire there in the background. In some ways, though, it's a quick turnaround. In 539, we're getting closer to Alexander. 539, there's another empire that plays a role here. Persia, the Persian Empire. Persia is modern-day Iran. So a little bit further to the east. Babylon's modern-day Iraq. So under Cyrus the Great, not related to Alexander the Great, even though they have the last name there. Cyrus the Great comes leading the Persians, and he conquers the Babylonians. Now, what he also does is when he conquers the Babylonians and comes into control of Judah, he says, hey, why don't you go ahead and rebuild your temple? It's fine with me. He issues an edict, which is recorded in the first chapter of the book of Ezra, where he permits them to return and to worship according to their traditions. He seems to have had a custom of doing this. We have archaeological finds. There's this like kind of a football-sized thing called the Cyrus cylinder that we have, which shows that he practiced this policy with a lot of different people. Now, why would a Persian king say, hey, go ahead and rebuild your temple, practice your religion, it's fine with me? Can you imagine why he might do that?
If you can get on the good side of as many gods as you can, I guess you go for that.
Yeah, so, you're kind of hedging your bets there, I guess. And also, if you don't have to unduly antagonize the people you conquered, they're going to be less likely to rebel. So it's like, as long as their religion doesn't stir up, kind of military opposition, they might actually be a little more docile if I let them worship according.
Yeah, once you've got these big empires in place, you don't have to go like city by city. You just sort of take over the big one, and then you get a lot of stuff with it. So since you're going to keep moving off to go conquer the Lydians or whoever, you want to kind of keep things chill back behind you.
Yeah, I think that's part of his policy there. Now, this is, Cyrus is one of the best loved non-Jews in the entire Bible. I mean, because of this, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, verse 1, in fact, Cyrus is referred to as the Lord's anointed. The Lord's anointed in Hebrew is Mashiach. That's the word Messiah, right? So they're not saying Cyrus is the Messiah. It's, he's a Messiah, an anointed one. So he may not be like, the status of what Jesus later will be, but that's like a pretty big honor for a Jew, a biblical writer here in Israel say Cyrus is the Lord's anointed. He was a liberator for them. So this begins in 539-ish, the Persian period, where the Persian Empire is in control of the land of Israel. And a lot of the books are written with that in the background. I've got to plug in my battery here. 2 seconds here. All right. So fast forward to 333 BC. here we are back at Alexander. So 334, 333 through right in those few years, Alexander goes on a march. He begins in Macedon up here by Greece. He conquers Turkey, the Holy Land right here, northern Africa, founds the city of Alexandria up there in northern Africa and Egypt. He does not go down into the Arabian desert down here, but he crosses modern day, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, like I said, all the way to the edge of India in about 10 years. Very impressive. And he conquers the Persians. He gains control of the Holy Land. And he begins what's called often the Hellenistic period of ancient Judaism. We'll talk about that in cultural terms probably next time. But Hellas is the ancient Greek word for Greece. Hellene is a Greek. We'll talk about Hellenic Greece. We'll talk about Hellenistic Greece. But he does, he makes Greek the common language of his empire. Previously, from the time of the Assyrians, the common language, the lingua franca of this whole region is Aramaic, which is related to Hebrew, different from Greek. But from this point forward, Greek becomes more of the common language because of the imperial, the kind of administration, the political sort of organization that Alexander institutes over this wide swath of the ancient world that includes basically all of the biblical world. So quite an impressive achievement. The peoples of the Bible fall under his jurisdiction at this point. And this Hellenistic, this kind of Greco-Macedonian empire that he establishes lasts for a couple of centuries, essentially, or the period that is kind of dominated by his empire lasts for a couple of centuries, until usually historians will say lasts till about 31 BC. 31 BC is a famous battle called the Battle of Actium, and it's famous because it's got a romantic story, and also Shakespeare retells it. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC is the naval battle at which Mark Antony and his girlfriend or wife, I can't remember, did they get married? Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra, are defeated by Octavian, who will, a few years after that, become known as Augustus Caesar. Cleopatra was a queen who was part of what's called the Ptolemaic dynasty, the dynasty of Ptolemy, who was one of the successors of Alexander the Great. And when they're defeated, Rome is firmly in control. Actually, they'd already been kind of in control of the Mediterranean, but they're firmly in control of the Mediterranean. So here again is a map of this large empire that in a very short period of time, Alexander conquered. So he goes to the edge of India. Like I said, his men who did love him, but were tired of marching. They didn't see any end. Where does this stop, Alexander? And they rebelled and said, okay, we're turning back. So they turned back. Alexander gets to Babylon. And one night in 323, he has a fever after a night of heavy drinking and partying and dies in 323. Now, what happens when a king, be it Alexander the Great or any other king, what happens when a king dies? What comes next?
You find out who gets to be the next king.
Who's going to be the next king? That's right.
And then they all kill each other.
Often it's like a scene out of The Godfather, right? So, there's a struggle for power. Who's going to take over once Don Corleone dies? Uh, so, go back to David. On the one hand, David got a very nice promise from God saying, "I'm going to make you a house. I'm going to make you a dynasty," which means, hey, there's some stability. We don't have to wonder who's going to be king, right? You got the transfer of power from king to the prince, from the king to the king's son. But then what if there is more than one son? Or what if the person who's next in line is not fit to be king? Then you get lots of struggle. That's what you had after David died. Here we have a different situation. When Alexander dies, he doesn't have a male heir. So he doesn't have a son to whom he can pass down his kingdom. So what he does is, and we see this in First Maccabees, the book that I told you about. So First Maccabees, again, is not in the Protestant Bible, it's in the Catholic Bible. It's written by Jews for, most of the apocryphal books are written by Jews about Jews and tell us a lot of stuff, a lot of valuable information about the time kind of between the testaments, between about 400 BC and about the time of Jesus. And this story is a big part of it, the story of kind of Hellenistic Judaism. Now, what he does is when he dies, we don't know if he does this on his deathbed or not, as is described in the book of First Maccabees and other ancient Greek documents. But what he does is divides up his empire between his top three generals. A guy named Antigonus, and a guy named Seleucus, and another named Ptolemy. And so them and their successors are usually called the Antagonids, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies, or the Ptolemies. It's up to you whether you want to pronounce that P or not. The Antagonids, so roughly speaking, if you're looking at the map of the Mediterranean and Jerusalem, Antagonids are up kind of close to Macedonia, in Greece, that region. The Seleucids have the region of like Syria and around around Jerusalem. And Ptolemy is down, like I said, down there with Cleopatra, the famous Cleopatra is Cleopatra the Seventh. I can't remember. There were many Cleopatras as part of that family, but they're down more in the region of Northern Africa, of Egypt. So you have Alexander dying, dividing up his empire. But those guys, those three generals, they didn't get to be top generals of Alexander the Great by being laid back and patient and passive. They weren't going to be content to just stay put, right? I don't know if they were friends before or not, but once they have it divided up, they started trying to expand their sphere of influence, right? To get more of the territory that might have been allotted towards one of their fellow generals. Now, again, who's in the middle of this? I mean, literally in the middle of it, you've got Israel, right? I mean, right there on the coast. If you go up around to the northwest, that's the region where the Antagonids are, right? And Seleucids are kind of in the middle. Ptolemies are kind of down around the coast to the southwest. And so as they try to move against each other, Israel's right there in the middle. And so we see Jerusalem being a point of contention, especially between the Seleucids and Ptolemies. Around the turn of the second, third century, around the year 200 BC, the Seleucids, the generals who are descended from Seleucus, one of his generals, come into control of the Holy Land, land around Jerusalem. So far, so good. I'm throwing a lot of names out there, a lot of dates out there. Some of this is probably familiar. Some of this may be new to you. I don't want to belabor the obvious, but I don't want to not explain anything that may be new to you. So let me just stop there and see if you're comfortable with where we are, if I need to repeat anything, clarify anything. Hearing no objections, I will continue then. So you have, here's where I want to turn back to the book of First Maccabees, because it tells a story that has political significance for the Bible. So the leader who's a successor to Alexander, who becomes very important in the biblical story, is a guy named Antiochus. Think of the city Antioch, which is big in the Bible. You know, Alexander goes and founds a lot of cities like Alexandria, as do many of his generals like Antiochus, Antioch, right? So the book of First Maccabees chronicles events from about 167 to 164 BC. The Seleucids are in control of Jerusalem. The king of the Seleucids is a guy named Antiochus IV. And there are Jews in Jerusalem who are very eager to absorb Greek culture, and probably also very eager to become part, to ingratiate themselves with the ruling elite of Alexander's successors. There's a story told in First Maccabees 1, told from the perspective of the author, who calls them renegade Jews. So you kind of get an idea of what he thinks about them. But they are very eager to conform to assimilate to Greek ways and become kind of collaborators with the Greeks. Many other Jews are not. And it tells of a story where Antiochus, the Greek king, sees a split in the people. And so he wants to divide and conquer them. Now, he's already kind of in control of them, but he sees this as a way to further solidify his control. What he does, with the support of some of the Greek-friendly Jews, he tries to basically outlaw Judaism. He says that you cannot offer the sacrifices to Yahweh. You cannot circumcise your children. Now, passing a law that says you cannot circumcise your children is essentially banning Judaism, right? If you circumcise your children, we will kill the child and hang the dead baby around the neck of the mother. Now, logistically, that sounds kind of like hard to do, but you can see that that's meant to be, a real deterrent, right? And he goes into the temple and sacrifices a pig on the altar in the Holy of Holies, thereby desecrating the temple. So this is quite aggressive, right? This is not Cyrus's approach, right? This is not live and let live. This is, we're going to wipe you out. We're not going to let you be neutral. We're going to wipe you out. Now, this is a cultural or religious sort of move, but it's also political in nature. And what it does among some of the people of Jerusalem and Judea is say, we can't take this anymore. I mean, I know you're the rulers and we're the ruled, and we have to put up with some things that we don't like. That's the nature of these things. But come on, this is too much. And so it begins, it sparks a rebellion called the Maccabean Revolt. There's a family under a man named Judah. The family gains the nickname the Maccabees. Maccabee means something like the hammer. So Judah the hammer and his family start a guerrilla warfare, a guerrilla war against the Greeks. This is a rebellion around 167. There are some Jews who are fighting to oppose this. So on the one hand, you have the hyper-Greek friendly Jews who are like, hey, let's get on, we don't need circumcision. It talks about how they would exercise at the gymnasium built in Jerusalem in the Greek fashion, which means exercising in the nude with Greeks. Now, what did Moses have to say about exercising the nude with Gentiles? Well, he didn't say anything about it, but I bet he would not have been okay with that. So they, on the one hand, were very eager to assimilate. On the other hand, you had some Jews who were opposing this, and they were hyper pious, hyper observant Jews. One group, First Maccabees tells about, that they're part of this rebellion against the Seleucid Greeks, but they're hyper, they're very observant, which means, what do you think they're doing on Saturdays, on the Sabbath? You don't do anything on Sabbath, right? I mean, that's the Sabbath, you rest. You do not work. Fighting is work. Now, if you're fighting an army against an army that is not going to fight on the Sabbath, what's your battle plan? What's number one on your battle, your program there? Attack on a Saturday, right? So they attack them on the Saturday, and that group of Jews, they do not fight back. They, are true to their principles, and they're slaughtered. They're wiped out. The Maccabees saw that happen and said, that's not going to happen to us. And so, like I said, they began guerrilla warfare that lasts for a couple of years, from about 167 to 164, about 3.5 years. And eventually, in 164, they are successful in expelling the Seleucid Greeks from Jerusalem. And First Maccabees chapter 4 tells the story of some of the aftermath. They expel the Seleucid Greeks, and they have to clean up the temple, and because it's been used for pagan sacrifice for a couple of years. So the story is telling of the kind of, they fumigate the temple, they clean it up, and they're going to rededicate the temple. And according to the story, there's enough oil in the lamps to burn the lamps just for one night. But does anybody know how many nights these lamps burn for? No. There you go. I think I see, yeah, not one, not two, not three, but 8 crazy nights. That is right. And so this is kind of a miracle, seen as affirming the providence of God and the justness of their cause. And the holiday, well, I guess I've got it. Do I have it up here anymore? Maybe it doesn't say, but what is the holiday that this is the origin story for? Anybody know?
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah, right. Not a Christian holiday, but a Jewish holiday. And so, yeah, it's Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah. So you got the menorah, so Hanukkah is a much, it's not a major holiday for, most Jews worldwide. It's bigger probably for American Jews than it is for Jews elsewhere, partly for cultural reasons in the 20th century, seen as kind of a counterpart to, or kind of a parallel to Christmas. So the story of Hanukkah and its significance in the United States among Jews is part of, kind of a cultural history. It's not in there are plenty of holidays celebrated by Jews, not in the Bible, but this, the big ones are Passover, Yom Kippur. But this is the story of the celebration of Hanukkah, which is mentioned. It's not called Hanukkah in the New Testament. In the Gospel of John, it talks about the Feast of Dedication. I think it's in John chapter 10. That's Hanukkah. So it shows up there. Now, I guess the bigger, well, I don't know if it's a bigger story or not, but in expelling the Seleucid Greeks, they are able, the dynasty, which is usually called the Hasmonean dynasty, establishes independent Jewish rule from about 164. Sometimes it'll be dated to the 140s, but we'll say 164. independent Jewish state starting in 164. Great, this is, calls for great celebration. So politically, the aftermath of Alexander's activities are kind of put on pause here, I guess you could say. So 164, you have independent Jewish state. Now, ironically, and we'll talk more about this in cultural terms next time, this story celebrating the successful Jewish resistance to the onslaught of Greek culture is a story of them winning a battle but losing the war. What I mean is they are successful in kicking out the Greeks politically, but this story about the successful resistance to the onslaught of Greek culture is now told in Greek. So the story is told in Greek. So long term, they weren't fully successful in that objective. Does that make sense? All right, so there's an independent Jewish state from 164 until who comes along next? We've had the Assyrians. I mean, if we go further back, the Egyptians. The Egyptians, we had the Assyrians. We had the Babylonians. We had the Persians. We had the Greek Macedonians. Who does that leave in terms of big empires who leave a big footprint in the Holy Land? This is an easy one, right?
Roman.
Yeah, the Romans, right. 63 BC, under Pompey the Great, come and occupy the region. Rick, did you have a question? So Pompey is part of what's called the First Triumvirate. He eventually is going to, a little bit after this, is going to get into a civil war with Julius Caesar, and he's going to lose that one. But he's, before Caesar really emerges, a little bit after this, he's the most powerful general in Rome. 63 BC, he leads the Roman army and beginning the occupation of Judea, Galilee. And so that brings to an end that century of independent Jewish rule. There will not be an independent, autonomous Jewish state again until 1948 AD. So from 63 till then, we have the land occupied by different people. Now, fast forwarding to the time of the New Testament, time after Jesus, that occupation is going to continue for quite a while. Perhaps the highlight of it, or the low light of it, would be the destruction and another Jewish revolt around the year 70, which results in the destruction of that second temple that had been rebuilt after the time of Cyrus, and the burning of the city. Now, what does this have to do with? So this is just one more example of another empire. So where does Alexander fit in that? Partly, also, the response to Alexander and his successors after the Maccabean revolt showed the Jews that, hey, we can be, we've done it before. We have fought off a large ruler and gained independence. If we've done it before, maybe we can do it again. And so it's not the entire story of first century Judaism, but a lot of what's going on, what we see in the lead, kind of the background of the early New Testament and the events during Jesus's life and for a generation or so after Jesus' life is, an intra-Jewish debate about, should we be striving for independence? Should we, like many of the Jews under the time, under Alexander's successors, should we be collaborating? Should we be assimilating? Should we be content to be part of a larger empire, even though we're not at the top of that empire? Should we be resisting it? Should we see the Romans as a tool of God, an agent of God, unbeknownst? The prophetic tradition is full of statements talking about different empires, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. serving a purpose and, being part of God's greater purpose, not meaning to. Often it's talked about like the Assyrians, the Babylonians are an iron rod in God's hand meant to chastise the Israelites. Should we see these conquering powers in that light? Should we see them as a blessing? Should we see them like Cyrus as like God's own anointed who has restored us to our place in Jerusalem? Should we be fighting against them? There's not one Jewish kind of approach or answer to that question. And it takes political forms, takes cultural forms, takes religious, philosophical forms. But again, so there are lots of people who were very eager to try to throw off the Roman yoke in this time. And again, some of that, and some of the way that the land gets divided up between different people like Herod and Herod's sons in the time just before, like when Jesus is born, and in the time like during Jesus' lifetime and that generation after. Those kinds of political realities are related to what's going on with Alexander, just in a different form under different players. But that's always there in the background, even though we're reading it for religious message. Often that political reality intrudes into the story very frequently. So let me stop. So I've got 10:37. I'll stop there. I don't know if there are any questions here at the end. Like I said, next time I want to talk more about cultural and philosophical and religious sorts of considerations. But that's a little bit of a political and military history, kind of revolving around Alexander and some of the things that come before and some of the things that came after. But any final questions? So I'll finish up in time to get you to the sanctuary for the service. But I guess if you're sitting where you're at.
Patrick, what was that Seleucid that went into the temple and basically tried to outlaw Judaism? What was his motive?
Usually, well, a lot of scholars think that he is trying to drive a further wedge between kind of the more kind of progressive Jews and the more conservative Jews. Others say his name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which means, God made manifest. He was often mocked and called Antiochus IV Epimanes, which means madman. One explanation is I don't know if there's really a motive, as he's just crazy, that he was just kind of like, megalomaniac, and this was just, one further step. So yeah, there are different explanations for that, but a lot of people would say it's kind of a divide and conquer strategy. So.
Patrick, would you characterize the Romans as benign leaders?
Some of the Jews did, and some of the Jews didn't. That was one of those big internal debates as well. There's a famous scene from a movie called the Monty Python's Life of Brian, which is set in the 1st century, but there's a famous scene in it where this kind of Jewish underground movement is trying to assassinate Roman leaders. And he's like, what have the Romans ever done for us? They bled us dry. And he's like, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then one at a time, the people in his little kind of like, kind of underground movement say, well, they built roads. Like, yeah, besides the roads. Well, they brought, sanitation and, wine and this and that, the other, the aqueducts. And he's like, okay, aside from that, what have the Romans ever done for us? And it's like, well, it brought us, but it's kind of like, well, they've done really quite a few things for us, even though we're kind of under their thumb. I'd rather be living under many Jews thought I'd rather be living under the Roman thumb than, somewhere else. They brought a lot of nice technological sort of cultural sorts of bonuses with them. So that was, so many Jews thought, yeah, they're pretty benign. Or at least they're not as hostile as the Seleucids. And so let's just try to get along. And others like, no, we're not going to we're not gonna coexist. So that was, that's you see that internal debate among Jews, even in the New Testament as well. Not in a funny way, but like I said, that movie presents it in a pretty humorous manner. All right, well, thank you for tuning in. We'll talk more next time. I don't know, Rick or Judy or Daniel, if anybody has any final shopkeeping here to do. Housekeeping.
Yep. But thank you, Dan. Thank you very much, Patrick. We appreciate it.
Have a good week. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.